Hello, my name is Andre Ward, and I'm the Associate Vice President of the David Rothenberg Center for Public Policy at the Fortune Society. Welcome to Both Sides of the Bars, a discussion-driven show that examines the legal system from various perspectives, including people most impacted by the criminal legal system. We discuss critical questions about how the current system works, its intersections with social justice, and we highlight the efforts that are being made to improve the lives of everyone impacted. We ask you, the listeners and the viewers, to spread the word about Both Sides of the Bars and share your comments with us on Twitter at the Fortune SOC. Today's show is entitled Automatic Expungement. Why is it so important for people with conviction histories? Over 70 million Americans have criminal records, which keeps many from accessing basic opportunities like employment and housing. Due to the prevalence of background checks, many people with past convictions feel they can never move forward with their lives. With 400,000 plus New Yorkers arrested on criminal charges each year, the exclusion of people with criminal records from employment opportunities via background checks and other barriers hurts productivity and deprives the workforce of crucial talent. The ACLU estimates that nationally, excluding individuals with conviction histories from the workforce costs the economy between $78 billion and $87 billion in lost domestic product. Automatic expungement is fundamental to addressing the wrongs of over-policing, excessive prosecution, and racial injustice in our criminal legal system, and to reducing the systemic barriers that disproportionately impact low-income individuals of color. In New York City, for example, 48% of those arrested for marijuana charges or marijuana possession in 2017 were Black, 38% were Latinx, and only 9% were white. In this episode, we're going to talk about the importance of automatic expungement for people with histories of involvement in the criminal legal system. Our guest is Judith Whiting, General Counsel for the Community Service Society, a Manhattan-based anti-poverty nonprofit organization. Judith, thank you so much for joining us today here at Both Sides of the Bars. How are you feeling today?
I'm great, thanks. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Judith, and thanks so much for taking the time out to allow our viewers to understand the importance of expungement. And so we'll get right into it. Judith, how did this campaign start? Why are you and the Community Service Society, of which you are part, involved in this?
That's a very good question. The activities and efforts to get expungement or sealing legislation automatically have been happening across the country. And, not so much in New York in past years. We had a system where, if your case was terminated in your favor, or if you had a violation level conviction, those cases were automatically sealed, but just about nothing else was. And in 2017, a law was passed that allows people to apply in very limited circumstances to get their conviction sealed. But it wasn't enough. The process is way too complicated, and so many people are left out. So at CSS, since about 2008, we have seen about 600 people a year to work with them to try to get copies of their New York State or FBI rap sheets. And we do this through a project called the Next Door Project. And we order the rap sheets free of charge, and then we sit down with people individually to go through them. And, pre-COVID, we often had a group intake where we do a Know Your Rights presentation and then answer questions, et cetera. And at every single intake, it was clear that I'd say probably half the room was there thinking that we could do something to expunge records, and telling us that, that they could not go forward without, something being done to seal or get rid of what they were facing on their record. And so, we at CSS had been involved in the campaign to get ban the box legislation in New York City. We worked hard with a number of other groups to help draft and help urge passage of the New York City Fair Chance Act. It's one of the strongest ban the box laws in the country, I think. And so we knew that we could get things started. And so we started our own, we thought, the conversation needs to start happening, and we can't do this on our own, obviously. And this is a very big group effort, but let's get the conversation going. So we started what we called our expungement campaign in 2016. We hired an organizer and we moved things forward to try to get the conversation going about why expungement and sealing are just so crucial. And we were, we went around the state trying to get, word out. We were very fortunate that in 2019, we got funded to bring this project to scale. We're working with Legal Action Center and about 6 other groups in a steering committee and about 100 groups together in what we're calling Clean Slate New York. And we are moving the Clean Slate process and legislation forward under the Clean Slate New York banner.
Got it. And so that work is critical and it's important. Certainly the Fortune Society supports that work and that advocacy and the actions associated with it. But Judith, what is Clean Slate and what does this legislation do?
That's a really good question, just like the first one. This legislation was sponsored last session by Senators Eleanor Myrie and Assemblymember Catalina Cruz. It was introduced, and unfortunately, we ran out of time at the end of legislative session to get it over the finish line. But we're very confident that things are going to succeed this session, and we're working very hard to make that true. What Clean Slate New York would do is it would automatically seal criminal convictions after a certain period of time after a person has completed their sentence. So if the conviction was for a misdemeanor, it would be 3 years after the sentence. If it was a felony conviction, 7 years after the sentence. And we're intentionally including just about every single kind of conviction here. The only kinds of convictions we were, unfortunately are not included are those for sex offenses. But felony convictions from A all the way down to E are included in this. We think it's exceedingly important that we not just be tinkering around the edges and sealing, very, minimal things. Everybody needs this help. And so the legislation would seal things automatically, like I said, after these periods of time. And the information would not be visible to employers, to landlords, to institutes of higher education. And so the idea is that it would allow people to move forward and really to become full participants again in the life of their communities.
Yeah, Judith, you and I were in New York City, so obviously this bill would impact New York State. But does New York currently have any legislation that automatically seals or expunges records?
Yes, we do. We have, as I say, the legislation that's been in place since the early 90s that would automatically seal violation level convictions or convictions that, or cases that were terminated in your favor. There is an expungement provision in the marijuana decriminalization and the MRTA, Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act. So we do have automatic expungement of all prior marijuana convictions that are now decriminalized. So if you were convicted of something that is no longer considered to be a crime under the new law, those records are now automatically expunged. And, we throw around the term expungement and sealing. I'm saying expungement for the marijuana convictions because, in fact, the law says expungement. We were, we very much wanted to introduce the concept and the term of expungement to New York state law. Other states do what we've done for decades and call it expungement. We've been calling it sealing. So we thought it was important to try to, change the nomenclature. But Clean Slate is now called, what we're doing under Clean Slate is called sealing because we found there was confusion about what expungement meant. And we were concerned that people thought we were physically destroying records, and that's not what the legislation would do. And there's a reason why we don't want to destroy records of convictions on some level. one thing is that if a background check is ever done, and by a commercial company, and they get the information wrong, you need to be able to show them the true information and get them to correct their records. If the information had been destroyed, you wouldn't have anything to go on. So that's important. Also, for immigration purposes, it's frequently important to have actual records of what happened, but have them be tightly sealed.
No, absolutely, Judith. And we talk about the nomenclature, right? And some people, it's good that you've been able to elucidate that point that, expungement and sealing, they clean slate use sealing to really accentuate like the point, right? Rather than allowing some ambiguity to exist within the definition of expungement. But Judith, can you talk a little bit more of those distinctions, right? Just a little bit more expounding just on the difference between like expungement and sealing. I know they're similar to some degree, but just a little deeper on why it's so important to use sealing. And I know you highlighted the point about people's perception of it was the destruction of records, etc., which is not the case.
Personally, my preference would have been to call what we're doing in clean slate expungement, because I do think it's important to bring our terminology current to what's going on in other states. Other states do exactly what we do with sealing and call it expungement. And they're out there trumpeting about the great work that they're doing with expungement, like it's a great new thing, stuff New York's been doing since the 90s. But I think what we found is that we just got way too much confusion from legislators, from the public, from others when we were talking about using the term expungement as we did in earlier drafts of the legislation. We got editorials out there saying like, they're going to destroy the records, they're going to destroy DNA, all these things that are going to, have criminal justice implications and bad, when in fact that was not true. But we found that there was just too much confusion, unfortunately. So sealing means that the records still exist, but they're tightly sealed and not accessible to others. So they still exist, but they are marked sealed. They're stamped if there's a physical record, sealed, and they are not accessible to the general public. They're not accessible to regular employers like Target or Duane Reade. I'm just making that up. Not accessible to landlords. Not accessible to institutes of higher education and things like that. I know it's slightly confusing, but we're using the term sealing here because it's maybe a better descriptive term of what's really going on with these records. Expungement in people's minds sounds like it's records destruction. And even though what goes on with the marijuana expungement is not records destruction, and we thought we could start to get the ball rolling using that term, it's still too confusing for people.
Yeah, thank you for answering that. Just giving us a little bit more clarity, our viewers here nationally, and for those who are with us here in New York State, specifically in New York City. I think that background and context is also important for folks to understand too. Which leads me to the next question, Judith. You kind of like got to it a little bit in terms of like responding, but to dig a little bit deeper, like how would automatic record sealing help people?
It would be extremely helpful for people who are looking for work, looking for a place to live, looking to get a further degree or training certificate, and not be held back by or somehow pinged by their records. What this allows people to do is move forward as themselves and not be forever tied to their record. A person is a person. A person is not a record. And yet when records are accessible to landlords, to employers, the humanity goes out of the situation, and people's qualifications and needs, desires, and wants, are completely secondary. So, it's just very important that that when a background check is done by a commercial company, that this information not be available, because it's used, it's used to deny. Right now, this information is available, and it's used to deny people jobs, to deny licenses, to deny apartments, stable housing situations, all the things that you need to have a solid basis to move forward with your life. And it's one of the last bastions of discrimination that some people, not myself, think is still okay. But what it really is race discrimination. It's another way of being, of engaging in race discrimination without coming right out and saying it, based on the statistics that you cited at the beginning of the broadcast. It's obvious who is being targeted by background checks and who's being denied jobs. It's a massive racial impact based on decades and decades of over-policing, over-prosecution, and over-incarceration in Black and Brown communities.
And so we know, Judith, too, right, it has a disparate impact on people of color, right? That kind of inherent bias and discrimination, specifically in areas that you reference, right? Mm-hmm. And so I know the Fortune Society is involved in the Fair Chance for Housing campaign here in New York City to end discriminatory practices in housing against people who have histories of involvement in the criminal legal system. So we see and we support fully clean slate, knowing that the value of expungement is so critical to allowing people to access the opportunities to simply live a life of contribution, Judith.
Right.
Right. And that's it, right? You want people to live a life of stability, to live a life of contribution. Mm-hmm. And also, in doing so, it contributes to public safety. What are some of your thoughts, just on reflective thoughts on that comment? I mean, you already know, Judith, but just any reactions or comments to that?
Well, if someone can get a job and a place to live, that's the absolute building blocks that you need to move forward. If you don't have those things, if we're denying those things to you because we're, insisting that you can never get beyond your record, some people say that they experience a conviction history as a civil life sentence. If we're imposing that on people, what do we expect people to do? How are you going to live? How are you going to support your family? It's a terribly fraught situation. And so clean slate would contribute to public safety because it allows people to move forward, be part of the economy, be part of their communities, and really step past the conviction history and no longer be associated with that. It's extremely important that we allow that to happen. And clean slate is some people are particularly people who oppose us are including this in their discussions of criminal justice legislation. I don't see it as criminal justice legislation. I see it more as racial justice legislation, economic justice legislation, housing justice, and on some level anti-poverty legislation.
Even human justice, right? Just like human justice, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, and go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I'm sorry, Judith. And it's interesting too, right? Because you raise this notion of what people are including in some of the criminal justice discussion, right? And some of the dialogue. And oftentimes it's a narrative that amplifies fear over fact.
Right.
So talk a little bit about that, right? Because it's this notion of propaganda or misinformation or fear getting ahead of facts.
Yep.
How important are the facts relative to a lot of what is amplified in these criminal justice discourse?
Facts are really important, but getting ahead of this, fear-mongering and intentional branding of this as pro-felon. I don't even want to say that, but that's the kind of thing that you read in the Post and other papers, that we're going to be unleashing people if people were ever leashed. It's something that we have to be very careful and very proactive about. We can't just rest on, the greatness of our facts. Our facts are true. Our facts are real, but we are facing intense propaganda, and we have to be able to, stand up to that and weave our facts into a counter narrative about why this is so extremely important and is not what it's being said it is.
Absolutely, Judith. And there was a recent Times article that kind of depicted what's happening on Rikers Island, and some of that language used in that article obviously is something that negatively lifts up and describes people that are detained and jailed and are incarcerated on Rikers Island. And so, to your point, we have to obviously have our facts, but our facts have to also be driven by actions. And those actions consist of these counter narratives through press conferences, through rallies, and other things to de-amplify those misconceptions and debunk those myths and obviously challenge those falsehoods, right, that are obviously being lifted up. And so I wanted to ask you, Judith, I know we're running out of time. I can talk to you all day, Judith, and so thankful again that you joined us from Community Service Society. But, people with past systems contact understand why we need to move forward and get this law passed. But what about people who don't see it as like personally affecting them, and how are you going to convince them to support it?
Well, that is the task that we face this legislative session, and we did last session too. It's what we're doing is putting forward the important information that this legislation affects and is important for everybody. This is important for us, our friends, our neighbors, our family, our society, our city, our state. We can't move forward if we're keeping people back. And so, to convince people who may not see this as affecting them, well, first of all, they're wrong. But what we need to be able to say is that, this is legislation that that provides, a clean slate and allows a measure of fairness that we haven't, had in New York State. We've been keeping people back, since the beginning of the carceral system here, and to try to explain why that's important, we need to put forward an economics narrative for some people. For other people, it's an anti-poverty narrative. The term anti-poverty has some resonance. It's an anti-poverty campaign. The housing aspect has a resonance. On some level, it depends who we're talking to. But I need to say that, what you mentioned about language is so important. We always, go back to Eddie Ellis's language letter because he's certainly not the first person who thought about it, but he's the first person who really put it out there in such a powerful way about why it's important not to be, using the same terms over and over and over again. We try very, very hard to push our campaign forward with the spirit that the late Eddie Ellis gave us.
Yeah, thank you, Judith. And how can people here in New York City, in New York State, get involved in supporting the Clean Slate bill and just get involved in the advocacy efforts and actions associated with that campaign?
Well, we are on Instagram, we're on Facebook, we're on Twitter. We have a website, www.cleanslate.org. We would love it if you joined us, followed us on any of those platforms. We are regularly having actions and rallies and town halls, Instagram Live sessions. We would love to incorporate you, have you be as active with us as you feel you can be. Our campaign is growing, and we would love to have you be a part of it.
And obviously, even if a person is not in New York State, right, and maybe in the other states, they too can still get involved. Is that correct, Judith?
That's right. Absolutely. Through following us on social media, through all of the things I just said. You need not live here. It's great if you do, but if you have a concern about what's going on in New York State, and how we're treating people and how we can, fix that through this legislation, I'd urge you to join us.
And obviously the meetings, you also have monthly statewide meetings that are held
Yes.
virtually. So folk who may be in different states that are also interested in advocacy and legislation as it relates to this can join virtually.
That's right. That's right.
Engage other stakeholders, community organizers, advocacy groups, and organizations that are pushing the bill. Is that correct, Judith?
That's right. Our monthly meetings are open to all members of the campaign, and just sign up with us on our website or through our social media platforms. And we bring you up to date, and on a monthly basis, it's done by Zoom. And I think that's going to continue no matter, how our public health situation improves, because we've been able to, it's much more convenient right now, though a number of our actions are beginning to be in person. But these monthly meetings, as you say, are by Zoom, and we'd love to have you join.
Judith Whiting, General Counsel for the Community Services Society, thank you so much for joining us here today on Both Sides of the Bars. And to our viewers, I thank you for giving us your thoughts. I thank you, obviously, Judith, for giving your thoughts and your observations about Clean Slate, which is really, really important. And I thank you, the viewers, for joining us all for this thought-provoking discussion here on Both Sides of the Bars. In the meantime, on behalf of the Fortune Society, we thank you so much for tuning into Both Sides of the Bars. If you're interested in finding out more about the Fortune Society, please check us out on the web at fortunesociety.org. That's fortunesociety.org, or on Facebook by typing in the Fortune Society. We're also on Twitter, as I mentioned very early on, and we ask that you use those platforms to learn more about the work Fortune is doing to engage our community, to engage people who are being released from jails and prisons, and ultimately the advocacy work that we're doing to effectuate meaningful change within the policy realm. My name is Andre Ward, and as always, I thank you for joining us as we critically look at both sides of the bars.